Hello learners, you are welcome to this lesson. My name is Annah Baguma, a teacher of economics. This is Unit 3, Lesson 1. Unit 3 is called Trade Protectionism, Free Trade, and Trade Protectionism. We are going to see about free trade and trade protectionism. That is the unit, and therefore that means the lesson is free trade versus trade protectionism. Trade protectionism. Meaning we are going to compare the two and how they operate. Now, before we start actually to see the content in it, we have the lesson objectives. We have to know that by the end of this lesson, you should be able to clearly distinguish between free trade and trade protectionism. At the same time, you should be able to critically examine the impact of free trade and trade protectionism as used in international trade. You should also be able to properly describe the tools used to protect trade in any given economy, and at the same time, you should be able to efficiently describe how the commercial policy may be implemented in any given economy. So I want us to be together so that at the end of the lesson, we shall be able to achieve these objectives together. Now let's pay attention to the whole lesson. We are going to see the difference between free trade and trade protectionism. Let's start by defining what is free trade. The word free itself. Now, before actually we see the definitions of the two, if we take a flashback in Unit 1, we saw what is international trade. We said that it is cross-border trade, or the exchange of goods and services between or among different countries. Now, the exchange of these goods involves the buying and selling of goods and services, that is visible and invisible trade. Now, if we talk of free trade, it means that the exchange of these commodities will be, you will be paying for them actually, but there is nothing hindering you from crossing the border to get commodities from other countries. So it is the unrestricted trade. It is the trade between or among countries that does not involve any barriers. Barriers as in taxes, barriers as in quotas, barriers as in sanctions and different ways, meaning free exchange of goods and services, movement of goods and services from one country to another without any hindrance. That is what we call free trade. Then for the case of trade protectionism, that means that is trade protectionism. It means that in this case here, we are protecting trade. If we are protecting trade, then that means there are restrictions. Restrictions may take the form of taxes, may take the form of quotas, may take the form of total bans, may take the form of different other things as we shall be seeing. So the difference between the two is free trade involves no restrictions of cross-border trade. You can buy commodities from Zambia, you can buy commodities from Ghana, you can buy commodities from Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania without any government hindrance, without any barriers by the government. But if it comes to trade protectionism, to protect, let's see the word to protect. It means there are restrictions. If there are restrictions, then that means that you are not allowed to freely move goods from one country to another. There are hindrances. So in that case, we shall have to see if we are having free trade and trade protectionism, we are going to see advantages of each. Now let's first see the advantages of trade protectionism. Now we are having how does free trade impact an economy. We are going to see the impacts of an economy. Let's go through. If we can see this here, we are going to have free trade. As we have said, free trade is trade between or among countries without any restrictions. Now let's see the advantages and disadvantages altogether. There are so many, but we are going to have a few which will give you a clue. When you're revising, you base on that to continue understand the points that will be in any book that we'll be revising. Now, for example, free trade permits large varieties of consumer goods to enter into the country. That means if there is no any restrictions, someone or each country or consumers in a given country will be availed with a variety of commodities, and that increases consumers' choice and improve their standard of living. However, if we allow different commodities to freely come into our country, as we have seen there is a variety, to a disadvantaged part of it, it will lead to cultural erosion, or there would be erosion of the national culture. What does that mean? We shall be consuming commodities that at times, in one way or the other, violate our culture. Actually, we shall be preferring other countries' commodities than our own commodities, and that would lead to cultural erosion. Point number 2, there is reduced costs by buying imported raw materials from abroad. Now, ahead, as we are going to see trade protectionism, there are restrictions. And if there are restrictions, commodities will be expensive. But this time in free trade, you will be buying commodities freely. You pass the border without paying taxes for them. As we know, the impact of a tax on commodities is the rising prices, or it increases the prices for the commodities imported. But this time, there is no any restrictions. So the commodity or the raw materials that we use to produce goods and services in the country will be cheaper. And that reduces the cost of production of buying imported raw materials. And that reduces the prices at home, which increases consumers' purchasing power, and they will be able to buy many commodities. However, on the other side, to the disadvantaged part of it, it discourages self-reliance or sufficiency. Now, if we keep on importing raw materials and other commodities into the country cheaply, now it discourages us from producing our own commodities, and that breeds the dependency ratio, and that kills our initiative to take root or to promote self-sufficiency or reliance. I think we are together. I want us to reason in that sense and see that free trade is good, but however, it is also bad. I'm using these points concurrently to show that even if it is good, but on the other side, it is also bad. We can also say free trade boosts specialization between or among countries. Countries and individuals and different other companies in the involved countries, they will be able to specialize and produce what they are good at, and therefore be able to exchange to other countries, since there is no any limitation on the marketing of such commodities. And that increases the country's production, productive capacity, increases the GDP and economic growth of the involved countries. However, due to the free movement of goods and services, and due to the urge to serve the wider market, it will lead to overexploitation of the natural resources to the extent that they will be exhausted, so that, to the future generation, they will not be able to obtain them. Also, free trade promotes competition and efficiency. Because we are having so many commodities coming from different countries, it means that we are trying to compare their quality and our quality. It will necessitate us also to improve the quality of our commodities. And therefore, that competition, to have market for our commodities, it will lead to efficiency. However, on the other side, our local industries are outcompeted by cheaper imported commodities. And that means if we are not keen enough, then our local industries will have to close down, or they will have to be outcompeted. And therefore, in most cases, you will find us having foreign companies instead of having our own local commodities. All right, I think we are together there with free trade advantages and disadvantages. That is the trade without restrictions and how it impacts the economy. Now let's see trade protectionism. It's how it works actually. We have said trade protectionism involves the different forms that the government imposes to restrict the flow of goods and services across the borders. The word is to control the flow of goods and services across the boundaries of a country, since we are involving different other countries. Now, trade protectionism has got two major forms. The major forms of trade protectionism are: one, we are having tariff barriers to trade. Tariff barriers to trade. Tariff barriers to trade. And two, we are having what we call non-tariff barriers to trade. In brackets, non-tariff barriers to trade. What are they, or how do they differ? Remember, we are protecting international trade in this case. Now, if we are protecting international trade, we are protecting it in two forms. The two forms are tariff barriers to trade and non-tariff barriers to trade. How do the two differ? When we talk of tariff barriers to trade, these are international trade protectionist measures that involve taxes. They are international trade barriers that involve taxes. Now, these taxes can be on either imports or on exports. What we have to put in our mind is we are not restricting only exports. I mean imports, but we also restrict exports. Now, what does this mean here? Then that means that if we come here on the tariff barriers to trade, we have, if it involves taxes, we can have taxes on imports. Therefore, we call it import duties. And if we are also restricting exports, we have what we call export duties. So that means that the tariff barriers are those international trade restrictions that involve taxes. The taxes can be on imports, the taxes can be on exports. If the taxes are on imports, we call them import duties. If they are on exports, we call them export duties. And a combination of the two is what we call customs duties. So customs duties, these are taxes imposed on either imports or exports. So in tariff barriers, we have only two examples, that is import duties and export duties. Now, if we go to the non-tariff barriers, by definition, the word is non-tariff barriers. So if we, for example, shield this non, we remain with tariff barriers up. So if we have non-tariff barriers, then that means that it is non-tax barriers to international trade. In short, they are restrictions to international trade that do not involve taxes, and there are a couple of them, or there are several of these examples. Now, these examples, we are going to have a sample of them as long as we have learned to distinguish between tariff barriers to trade and non-tariff barriers to trade. Tariff barriers involve taxes, whereas the non-tariff barriers do not involve taxes. Now, let's have an example here. I mean, some examples here. The examples we are having of the non-tariff barriers, let's have a few of them. We are having quotas. We are having embargoes. We are having sanctions. We are having import monopolies. Import monopolies. We are having, let's also have some other things, trade license, trade licenses. We are having also, for example, preferential treatment. As I said in the beginning, we are just having a sample of them. If we have a crew of these, then as we read or widely read via the textbooks that we normally have and the REB e-learning platform, we should be able to understand as long as we have understood what is trade protectionism itself. Now let's start with a quota. When we talk of a quota, this is a limit on the physical quantities that should be imported or exported outside the country. What we have to first put in our mind is we are not all the time on restricting exports. There comes a time when we need to also restrict exports, especially if what we have in the country is not enough. For example, let's take an example. If we are producing tea and tea in the country is not enough, then we shouldn't export it all and we remain with nothing. Therefore, there should be a quota of what we should export so that the domestic population also remains with what to consume. So international trade protectionist measures are not all the time saying we are restricting imports. And for your information, by the way, there is when we lack some commodities in the country, we have inadequate supply of that commodity. And yet in the country, the population sincerely needs it. What do we have to do? We have to increase on the import of quotas so that we serve everybody in the economy so as to improve the living standards of the citizens. So that means that if we talk about the quotas, we are trying to restrict the physical quantities of goods and services that are supposed to either be imported or exported. Now let's dwell on the importation because the major purpose for trade protectionism, in most cases, it is to protect the domestic infant industries to take root. Now let's assume we are dealing with imports, for example. We have to limit the amount of imports that should be coming into the country so as not to fight the domestic countries. Let's take an example. The government of Rwanda limited the amount of second-hand clothes, commonly known as chagua, so as to let the made in Rwanda clothes to have market. If chagua wasn't stopped, then the made in Rwanda clothes would not be having market. So quota is limiting the amount of commodities which are supposed to be entering the country or leaving the country. Then for the case of embargo, at times it is always called a total ban or total prohibition. If we talk of the total ban, that is complete restricting, complete stopping of importation, production, and manufacturing of a given commodity, especially when it is harmful to the lives of the citizens or when it does not match with the culture of a given country. A good example here, or if it is not matching with the environmental standards of a given country. A good example here, we can talk about, for example, the ban of the polythene bags or the polythene papers because they are not environmental friendly. There is also a total ban on what we normally call kanyanga. I can see most of you laughing. I think you know it. Kanyanga, this other kind of, I would say, alcoholic drink that is toxic to the lives of the citizens. Whoever is having it in the country, it doesn't mean that it's not there, but people do smuggle and bring it in there. But officially, Kanyanga is not supposed to be imported into the country. And of course, pornographic films and different others. They put a total ban on them, never to import or manufacture them because of different other reasons. It is either economic, social, political, and different others. An embargo is permanent. Once they say they don't want polythene papers or bags, then they are not needed in the country. That is a total ban. Now, when we talk of a sanction and an embargo, they are normally used interchangeably. Now, what does this mean? They all limit the importation or production of a given commodity. Now, with the total ban, it is or the embargo, it is permanent. Then for the case of a sanction, it is a limitation on the importation of specific commodities from a specific country for specific reasons. Those reasons might be maybe internationally unacceptable manners or behavior from a given country over another country, or the violation of human rights. For the meantime, they put a hold on the importation of a certain commodity from a given country for such reasons. Now, if such a reason is over, and I mean a sanction can always be uplifted. So this is permanent, embargoes are permanent, and then these ones are temporary, which means that a commodity cannot be imported for a given period of time. After such a problem is rectified, you can always import that commodity. So this is permanent and this is temporary. Now we have import monopolies. When we talk of import monopolies, this is where now the government decides to say none other than the government agencies are supposed to import a given commodity into the country. That is in case they see if they let it to be imported by any other person or other private agencies, then it would be much in the country and distort the local production. So government monopolizes the importation of a given commodity. Then we are having trade licenses. When we talk of a license, it is a written a permission actually that allows an individual, a company to operate a given activity or a given business. Now, when it comes to the trade licenses, it means that the licenses to be given to importers or to exporters will be limited depending on the prevailing conditions in the country. If we feel we want to promote more exportation of a given commodity or given commodities, then let's reduce the fee of giving those licenses. Remember, a license is not always free. You have to pay to get that permission. So if we want to promote the production and exportation of a given commodity, many people who are willing to produce that commodity and export it can be given licenses, where possible free of charge to the exporters, or where possible reduce on the fee. Then if we want to discourage the exportation or importation of a given commodity, we can always hike the license fee in order to discourage many people from participating in the importation exercise. Actually, leave alone the fee, they can make the procedure to get such licenses so long enough. You follow that bureaucracy till you get tired and you pull out. And therefore, you will be discouraged from applying for such a license that will hinder you from importing given commodities. Then we are having preferential treatment. Preferential treatment, how does it work? Now, we said we are having tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. This is a non-tariff barrier. All these we are explaining here are the non-tariff barriers. How will the preferential treatment work? This means that where you want to treat someone in a friendly way, you're going to reduce on the number of restrictions. You're going to reduce on the weight of the restrictions. For example, if there are taxes that you are imposing on different commodities coming from other outside the country, and you want to give a preferential treatment to a given country, other countries you will charge high taxes to those countries, but to another country you want to give a preferential treatment because maybe you have bilateral agreements together or whatever. That means you have to reduce on the taxes for them. So the preferential treatment is all about reducing on the weight of the restrictions that you are imposing on a given country. There are so many restrictions to trade or trade protectionist tools. However, you will be reading from them. Now, why do we apply all this? For example, it is to let the domestic industries grow. It is also to safeguard the lives of the citizens in case such commodities are dangerous. It is also to promote relationship between different countries. And if we go ahead now and explain the advantages and disadvantages of trade protectionism, we can say it keeps money at home. What does it mean when we say it keeps money at home? That means if they restrict imports, you will be consuming locally made commodities. The money will remain home, promote development at home, and everything will be all right. However, that would lead to trade diversion. What does it mean with trade diversion? If they stop imports, for example, if they stop importation of a given commodity, you will be subjected to high prices in the economy, and that will, of course, deteriorate the living standards. At the same time, it increases government revenue through import and export duties. However, on the other side, where they impose taxes on borders, then people will start to smuggle. I think you know those other people who smuggle commodities. Fraud will be too much in the country. And it also cements the relationship between two countries, especially where you give the preferential treatment to another country. But on the other hand, it might spoil the relationship between countries where you impose high taxes on its commodities. Actually, it will result into what we call tit for tat. They retaliate actually by protecting your commodities. Now the governments, they have to, for example, set policies at home so as to restrict how importers and exporters interact, or how different individuals and companies interact with the outside world. That is what we call the commercial policy. Commercial policies are laws and regulations that the domestic government imposes in order to restrict the flow of international trade. How we relate, improve production at home, and also relate with other outside countries. You develop infrastructure, you, for example, promote peace and security, and for example, you can give subsidies to different other countries. And that will help you to grow your economy. Now, there are revision questions that you can get based on the knowledge you have got from the lesson, which will help you a lot. Other than that, for more reading, I refer you to Senior 6 Economics book for Economics for Rwandan Schools, of course, with the e-learning platform, REB e-learning platform, that will help you to read more intensively or deeply about free trade and trade protectionism. Otherwise, this brings us to the end of the lesson. Thanks for your active participation. See you soon.